is preparing to meet these new problems when the policy debates come up early in January and in February of next year. We will be wanting to work with the administration on a truly bipartisan effort. If that's not possible, then the Democrats will offer an alternative that meets the problems and straightens out the economic mess that exists.
Well, critics, including the Democrats, have said that the problem with the Reagan economic program was that it tried to do the impossible, to fight inflation and boost economic growth at the same time. And David Stockman's been saying, obviously, that he can see this as a difficult problem, and it's hard to run a consistent economic policy aimed at those two goals. That problem remains for the Democrats. What specific measures would you propose?
Well, basically, the administration's program was internally inconsistent. You couldn't do all of the things that they said could be done. It was virtually impossible to achieve. What the Democrats offered was to try something that was truly new, something a lot of people have talked about and nobody has achieved in several years, and that is to live within our means, to make an all-out attack on federal deficits, to bring those deficits in line so that it takes pressure off high interest rates and inflation. As you do that, you increase the incentives for investment in new plant and equipment, which has an effect of improving productivity. That also has an effect of providing more jobs and reducing the unemployment rolls. And all of that works together to increasing revenues for the federal government and further reducing the deficits. That was the plan that we offered. To do that, the plan has to be fair. You have to have spending cuts. There's no question about that. But the domestic programs that affect basically the low-income sector of our economy cannot take the lion's share of those sacrifices. All waste has to be ferreted out, and that includes Pentagon waste, which was not really done in this effort.
But that sounds rather like the Reagan economic program. You're still promising to fight inflation and somehow to get the economy growing at the same time. Surely this attempt to cut the deficit would in fact depress the economy, even if interest rates were lower. Sounds rather like a traditional conservative policy of fighting inflation, which involves high unemployment.
What the Democrats offered was a conservative economic policy, one that could work. And I think it's generally recognized that had our alternative passed, we would not be facing the unemployment rate that we do today. Inflation, interest rates would not be where they are today, and we would be facing real economic growth and real investment. Inflation is a #1 problem that has to be brought under control, and if it's not brought under control, we will continually go through these peaks and valleys of high inflation and interest rates with deep recession and then high inflation, deep recession. That has to be cut out, that has to cease, and that was the essence of the Democratic platform and program. The difference was the administration's program was somewhat of a Rube Goldberg mixture between Keynesian economic stimulus policy, as Dave Stockman said, a trickle-down tax policy, and then a policy that cut spending, but cut it very much on one side of our social scale. The component parts were inconsistent and therefore unworkable.
Mr. Bodie?
Congressman Jones, last summer David Stockman entered a battle with Caspar Weinberger that eventually he seems to have lost. He was telling Bill Grider of the Washington Post, now published in Atlantic Monthly magazine, that at that time that he could cut $30 billion from the Defense Department just in waste, mismanagement, fat. Given 1 week to do that, he could do that. You mentioned that a moment ago. What happened to that effort?
Well, I don't know for sure, and I don't know if Dave Stockman's $30 billion in waste is overstatement or not. I do know that last year we asked the General Accounting Office to identify waste in Pentagon spending, and they identified several $billion that could be cut in 1982 without jeopardizing our defense effort. In the spring, the Democratic alternative cut the growth in Pentagon spending by $16 billion over the next 3 years. At that time, the administration, indeed the President, in a joint session to Congress, said that such cuts would be jeopardizing national security. Sometime over the summer, those recommended cuts did take effect, and the President endorsed them in September. But clearly, the Pentagon is, when they're spending $1.6 trillion over the next 5 years, one department cannot spend it efficiently and effectively, and it's going to lead to even more waste unless we get it under control.
Congressman, this week you said that the Democratic plan, and you and Tip O'Neill both have said the Democratic plan is going to come down in January. You want to put it off till January. But you've also said that you're going to have to cut spending more and you're going to have to raise taxes more to balance the budget. It's not January, but can you give us a little preview of where you would propose cutting taxes and where you would, raising taxes, I mean, and where you'd propose cutting spending?
Basically, there are three major alternatives to raise revenues. One was the so-called loophole closing and the excise tax increases that have been recommended by the Republicans in the Senate. Another is to put a surtax on, similar to what was done by the Johnson administration in the Vietnam War. And a third is to have some sort of a formula to determine whether or not this economy is responding to the Reagan economic program. And if it's not, to postpone, say, the third step of that tax cut until the economic performance comes in line with what it's supposed to do. I'm inclined to think, at this time, that that is the better alternative, to make the third step of the tax cut contingent upon the economic performance of in this country.
Congressman, about a month ago, you said we needed more time to know whether the economy was responding to the Reagan plan. Do we still need more time? The president says we now have a recession. We're in a recession. We have a higher unemployment each month.
Well, what I meant by that is that there is still a feeling that the president's program should have time to work, and I agree with that. Even though many parts of that program were effective earlier this year, as the president says, the full part of his program went into effect in October. The signposts do not look good as far as achieving the goals that they've set out for themselves. What I have said is we need to measure this program by the standards the administration set for itself in inflation, unemployment, interest rates, real economic growth. And next year, when the policy debate takes place early in the year, if those standards are not being met, if we're moving away from them rather than toward them, then I hope that we will have the courage to make the necessary corrections, to do what's right for the country. And if that's the case, I think they will find the Democrats in the House ready and willing and prepared to do what's good for the country as opposed to any kind of a partisan stance.
Mr. Kalb? Mr. Jones, if David Stockman were sitting in your seat right now and the Atlantic Monthly magazine had not been published, he would be speaking with the same kind of confidence about the large economic forces in this country as you are now. And yet he said, quote, "None of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers. It's not clear how we got there, and it's not clear how Jones is going to get there either." What can you tell us to give us some sense of confidence that you indeed have a better grasp of these large forces than he admits he did not?
Well, I guess the main thing that I can say is that the predictions that we made, the concerns that we expressed in the spring, are being borne out by the facts in the fall and the predictions now for early next year. Virtually every criticism that we leveled last spring is coming true today. And so what we tried to do was to understand the figures, to understand the mix in policies, to determine whether or not it would work and in what ways it took to make it work. I think the facts have borne out that we did understand what we were talking about.
Did you predict the recession that came?
We predicted that it would create more unemployment than the administration was willing to recognize. As a matter of fact, during the debate, one of the Republican members who criticized our plan criticized me personally for saying that I wanted to have higher unemployment, that I wanted to have higher interest rates, that we wanted to have higher inflation. That was not the case at all. What I tried to do is to be honest with the American people and said, if you do these things, it's going to result in these consequences. And what we predicted has come true.
Do you believe that the president consciously misled the American people?
No, I wouldn't make that charge. I think that whatever happened, it's a setback for what we're trying to achieve. There was enormous confluence of opinion in the United States that we could not continue to have government spending run away as it did, that we had to get our economy under control, and that we had to have real economic growth. There was enormous faith placed in this administration and this program. What is really damaging about the Stockman article is that it would indicate that the American people were misled in placing that faith in part of that program. And I think what is terribly important is that we not lose the faith of the American people and that we set out a program that can be achieved. Because if we don't do that, public opinion could change very rapidly, and we might lose this one golden opportunity we have to reinvigorate a free market system and a private, strong economy in this country. And if public opinion changed because of our mistakes, that would be a tremendous shame.
Mr. Chairman, how do you answer President Reagan's observation that if the Congress had gone along with him to make the tax cuts retroactive to January 1st instead of effective about 6 weeks ago, the recession might not have happened?
Well, I would make these two observations. First of all, the business incentives and investment incentives were basically retroactive back to January 1st, and the bipartisan leadership of Congress and the administration agreed on that point, and that was the case. With regard to the rest of the tax bill, I think it has to be pointed out that the entire tax bill and the entire budget program, including spending cuts and the macroeconomic budget program, were what the president endorsed, what he said was necessary to get this country moving. And when he signed those bills into law in August, he said this is going to get us on the way to recovery. So I'm taking him at his word in August when he signed the bills that stated that this is what he wanted.
Ms. Atkinson?
You mentioned the importance of cutting the federal deficit and reducing federal spending. But many economists believe that with the economy now going into a recession and unemployment rising, it's already 8% and looks as if it's going to go higher, the worst thing for the economy would be if federal spending were cut further and taxes raised or tax cuts postponed, as this would slow economic growth down even more and make the recession worse. What's your answer to that?
Well, this is another reason why I have counseled against charging into a 180-degree U-turn in the Reagan economic program. We don't know for sure what that program is going to result in, whether it's going to be a very deep, long recession, whether it's going to be a short recession jumping back into high interest rates and inflation, or whether indeed it will eventually work out as the administration says it will. Consequently, we don't know the right prescription to solve the problems that we foresee. So it's very true if the recession is deep and long. You don't want to have huge tax increases. In further spending cuts, if that recession is deep and long, you want to be selective as to where those cuts are made.
So you might think that the next installment of the personal income tax cuts should go into effect next July if the economy is still rather depressed.
As we see the situation right now, that would be my suggestion. But I again say that it argues very strongly for us to wait until early next year when we have a clearer idea as to where this economy is going, and at that point we make the kinds of necessary changes to get us on toward the goals that all of us want to achieve.
So at that point you might decide whether to continue fighting inflation or fighting unemployment.
Well, I don't think we can abandon the fight against inflation, and I think if indeed the Democrats come up with an alternative and are forced into another fight, that alternative will not go back to the business as usual, more government spending, bigger government, unrestrained growth in spending. That is not going to be the Democrats' answer. We are going to have to get the underlying causes of inflation under control, or we're never going to straighten out this economy.
Mr. Bodie?
Congressman, David Stockman article says that he had an advantage last spring in working with you folks because he had a spy on your committee. Congressman Phil Gramm of Texas was giving him information about your plans and so forth. Now, Congressman Gramm wound up to be a co-sponsor of the president's bill on the floor, and he wound up to be a chief salesman for it with conservative Democrats, among conservative Democrats. Now we find out he was also a spy. I have two questions for you. First of all, what might he have told David Stockman out of those deliberations that could have helped Stockman? And secondly, since the Democratic Party still only controls the House of Representatives in this town, isn't it time for the Democrats to begin to put a little spine in the opposition party to enforce some party discipline on people like Phil Gramm?
Well, let me first of all say could Phil Gramm have told David Stockman. Whether or not he was a spy and talked about tactics is something I can't tell. I guess my regret is that we were not convincing enough or forceful enough to convince Phil Gramm that we had a better idea and that the administration ought to adopt it. Had that been the case, had he been able to convince David Stockman that David's private concerns and criticisms should become public and they ought to adjust their program, then we wouldn't be facing the kinds of problems we have today with the economy. As far as party discipline is concerned, well, the Democratic Party is always going to be somewhat of an undisciplined organization. As Will Rogers of Oklahoma used to say, he belonged to no organized political party. He was a Democrat, and I think that's still true today. Discipline, if there is a violation of party caucuses or a violation of the kinds of things you talk about in party strategy, then that would call for discipline. To this point, I can't say that Phil Gramm violated that kind of caucus confidence.
Congressman, you've become something of a political target at home. To change the subject for just a moment, the famous political action committees independent political action committees have operated to create a committee to replace Jim Jones in your district. Now, this is set up by NCPAC, the National Conservative Political Action Committee that operates out of Washington, has budgeted $100,000 to replace Jim Jones, putting out flyers that say Jim Jones doesn't represent the 1st District, Jim Jones doesn't represent Oklahoma. They have television advertising and so forth. They linked you with Tip O'Neill as the chief two individuals who have stopped Ronald Reagan's economic program. Now, you've gotten a taste of what independent political action committees are all about in your own district, Congressman. Are these just a matter of free speech protected by the First Amendment, or is this a loophole in the election laws that ought to be closed?
Well, it could be a loophole. I'm not that familiar with changing the election laws to stop these. Frankly, I don't mind people expressing their points of view. As a matter of fact, with a group like NCPAC, which is clearly a group of outsiders that have no relationship to Oklahoma, I don't understand the state. As a matter of fact, they even ran an ad seeking an opponent for me, and they ran it in my hometown where I grew up of Muskogee, which is no longer or anywhere near the circulation area of my district, so they don't even understand my district. I don't mind that because I think having these ideas open to public scrutiny, the people can make a good judgment as to whether or not they're true or not. In this particular case, I have stayed in close touch in my district. I go home on the average of every other weekend. We have questionnaires. We have radio call-in programs. We have all the means of communications, town hall meetings, etc. And I'm not concerned about a bunch of outsiders coming in and spending their money in Oklahoma. I just hope it helps the economy of my district.
We have a bit more than 1 minute, Mr. Kalb.
Mr. Stockman's problem seemed to be that he had a theory and then reality conflicted with his theory, and he ran into trouble, and so did the administration and perhaps the country. Do the Democrats have a comparable theory that they would like to apply to economics?
Yes, I think our theory is one that we pretty well explained in the first budget resolution, and that is you have to get deficits down. You have to take the pressure off of inflation and high interest rates. You have to have a better mix of fiscal and monetary policy, and you have to have a tax program that is fair, that does not give to a $100,000 family a $2,100 tax break, while to a $20,000 family a $200 tax break.
So where would your priority be?
Our priority still would be getting inflation under control, getting those deficits down, having a balanced budget, and having real incentives for building up the supply side to get people back to work.
Thank you, Congressman Jones, for being with us today on Meet the Press. I'll be back in a minute with a look at letters. Commenting on last week's program with White